Hi, everyone. Welcome to the It Hurts to Mom podcast. I'm Lauren Rose, and today we're talking about teaching financial literacy to our kids. Our guest is Clifton D. Corbin, RFC, registered financial consultant and MBA. Clifton was a business consultant with over 2 decades of experience when he left the office to become a full-time stay-at-home dad. During this time, he authored his first book, Your Kids, Their Money, which focuses on providing parents with the skills and tools to teach financial literacy to their children. Welcome. Thank you for coming on.
No, thank you. I'm looking forward to this conversation.
So am I. Like I told you before we started recording, I didn't know I even wanted to cover this topic until I saw you post it as a possibility. And I think it's fantastic for any kind of parent. So I'm really excited.
Excellent.
So, what is financial literacy and why is it important for our kids to learn?
Great question. So I like to say financial literacy is the what, the why, and the how of using money. So it's important that we know what we're doing, why we're doing it, and then make sure we know how to do it. As a parent myself, one of the things I really want to do is I want to make sure that my children are set up for success once they become young adults. Some of the challenges I had as an adult was not knowing how to manage credit cards and, plunging myself into debt and, managing my way through that challenge. So one of the things that I really wanted to do for my children and anyone's children for that matter is to make sure that all of the skills and knowledge necessary to be, comfortable managing your money are acquired before our children need them.
That makes so much sense. And I think a lot of us don't talk to our kids about money because we think they're too young or they don't have really any money yet. So I think that's a really good point. What are the 4 basic principles of financial literacy?
It's another good question. So the way I like to break down financial literacy, at least when I'm talking about it with parents or with kids, it's almost like the phases of using money. So you need to acquire money. So there's different ways of acquiring money, whether that be through working or investing, or even debt is another way of acquiring money. You need to be able to use that money in some ways. So making sure that you're using it, again, hopefully responsibly, so that you're, one of the things I sometimes talk about is, retail therapy is a thing, but being aware of retail therapy is a good way of making sure that you're not using, your money, spending money to make sure you feel happy. So using money is another piece of it. Planning, that's another part of it. So making sure that we're, taking the appropriate steps to get to our financial goals, whether that be financial independence with retirement, or even just saving for those bigger, let's say, items like education for our kids or a home or what have you. And the other part of it is making sure that we're securing our money. So making sure that the wealth that we grow is properly secured so we don't lose it. So that's insurance, that's banking. So it's those 4 basic steps or 4 basic phases of using money. I like to call it the 4 principles of financial literacy, and just making sure. And again, like I said before, it's the how, the what, and the when. So it's how all those things go together to make sure that you feel comfortable, you feel confident, you feel like you're comfortable in all the different stages of your life. So like you said, young people don't have a whole lot of money, so it's making sure that they're just building those early habits. But as you get older and you get some more independence and you start having to manage your money, it's making sure that you're budgeting and that you're thinking about those long-term financial goals that you might have, and making sure that you're securing your money to make sure that a loss of employment or an emergency or some disaster, whether it be natural or not, doesn't destroy the wealth that you've been able to create. And then making sure that you're using your money in appropriate ways for you. And I don't try to prescribe what appropriate is. I really just want you to know what is it that you're trying to achieve, and making sure you're doing it in whatever way that you think makes the most sense for you.
So since kids don't have very much money, sometimes they don't have any, like what age do we start talking to our kids about money?
I love that. So for me, I like to say when kids start to recognize money as a means of, trade or transaction, I think that's a great time to start bringing up the subject of money. So if you're at the grocery store with your kids, I know a lot of people probably ordering groceries and getting it at home now, but even if you're at home and your kids are like, what are you doing online? And there's all these moments throughout our day where our children are recognizing that we're doing something and we're getting something, whether that be a service or a product. So once our youngsters start recognizing that, it's a great time to start talking to them about, well, I'm using money right now, or when you see me tapping this card on here, it's because it's taking money out of my bank account and it's going into this business's bank account. So you could start talking about the flow of money at the early ages, because our kids, they recognize it, they see it. Like there's rarely a day where you go through where you're not using money or you're not interacting with something that has some ties to money. So our young people, they see it, they're getting a sense of it, but it's up to us to make sure we're giving a clear understanding of what it is that we're doing, so that they can start getting a clear understanding of what they will need to do as well. But you brought up another point, and that our young people don't always have access to money. So once they're old enough to kind of manage the math that goes with managing their own money, I love to encourage allowances if it's within your family's budget. So I often preface that statement with, personal finance is personal first. So if if it's not within your budget to provide your child with an allowance, then, that's fine. But if it is within your budget to provide your child with an allowance, I think giving your child an allowance is a great way to give them access to money, so that they can start practicing some of those things that we're talking about, whether that be saving, donating, transacting, just managing and securing their own money. So all of those things can be managed with an allowance. And if you go to my website, or if you check out my book, I even give ways that you can give an allowance even if you don't think you have the money in your budget. And I'm happy to dive into some of those if you would like, if you'd like as well.
Yeah, I'd love for you to talk a little bit about allowances, because everybody has a different idea of what it should look like, how much the kids should get, how often they should get it. Should chores be, part of the allowance? What's your view on all that?
Sure. So with regards to chores, I don't love tying chores to allowance. And I know that's usually the biggest one. A lot of people are very much either on one side of that camp or the other. But I'll give the rationale for mine. And like I said, it's, for me, my main objective is giving our children opportunities to practice some of these skills. So if you feel like you need to tie chores to allowance and you hear what I say and you're like, I don't care, don't take what I say, but what I want you to do is take the objective, which is giving your child an opportunity to practice using money. But the reason I don't like tying chores to allowances is because, again, my objective is to give your child opportunities to practice. And if, let's say, they don't complete their chore and they don't get the allowance, now the chore is not done and they lose the opportunity to practice the skill. So I often equate it to, if you don't require your child to complete chores to do piano lessons, then I would kind of keep that same philosophy of, like, the piano lesson is an opportunity for them to practice and learn a skill. The allowance is an opportunity for them to practice and learn another skill. What I would think is a more important skill, and that it's a life skill that they'll need for their whole life. So I don't want to deprive a child that opportunity to practice using money because they didn't complete a chore. And there's other reasons why I don't like using chores and allowances to go together. It's, there's some challenges with regards to how we want to motivate our child with regards to intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. And there's a few other reasons why I don't like putting them together, but the main reason is just that, like, I really want to give our children as many opportunities to practice using money as possible, especially at an early age. So that's why I don't like tying it to chores. You had a few other questions there. I think one was like when and how much.
Mhm.
How much, again, that really depends on your budget. One of the things I was alluding to earlier, like, if your budget doesn't allow for, let's say, quote unquote, extra money to give as an allowance, one of the ways you could do it is look at your budget and say, well, what was I going to spend my money on for this child anyways? So let's say I was going to buy lunch for this child. I can let them manage the lunch budget or the breakfast budget, or I can let them manage their clothing budget. Because what I want eventually, even as if you have the money for an allowance or not, what I would hope for is, as your child gets older, let's say into the middle and teens, that they're managing budgets. They're not just getting an allowance, but they're managing, their toiletries, they're managing their clothing budgets, they're managing their food budgets to some degree. So they're getting some experience actually having to live within a set amount of money. So if you can't find money in your budget for an allowance at an early age, you can just move straight to that step of, here's, whatever I was going to spend on breakfast for you. Come to the grocery store with me. You're going to buy the groceries for breakfast for this week. And that's another way where they're, again, getting an opportunity to practice those same skills. And it's not any extra money. It's the same money you were going to spend anyways, only you're empowering them to learn the skills that they're going to need. So more generally with regards to how much do you give for an allowance, there's general guidelines. Some people say 50 cents to a dollar for every year. So let's say if you're 6 years old, you might get, let's say, $3 for an allowance. It really depends on your family. It depends on what you feel comfortable giving. I don't prescribe, again, I don't prescribe any specific amount. I'll highlight what some people do. What I don't suggest is that you give them so much that they don't feel the need to save.
Mhm.
Because one of the things you really want to encourage is that habit of saving and delayed gratification. So if you give too much, they'll lose the opportunity to do that. So one of the things is whatever you decide to do as far as like how much you want to give, make sure it's some amount where they still have to save up over the course of a week or 2 or 3 to get some of those bigger ticket items. And again, if they're older, maybe they might even feel like their allowance isn't enough and they may need to supplement that with a part-time job. That's a great bonus, and that now they're learning some other skills that they'll need to have as they go through life. So the when, it really depends again on your child, and can they manage the math, can they manage holding and securing money. Young kids, they see money, it's more of a toy than a resource and a tool. So you just have to kind of gauge where your child is at to determine that. But if they can manage the math and they are responsible enough to actually go out to a store and keep their money safe and secure, they might be ready.
Cool. Yeah, we give our daughter an allowance. She gets $5 a week. She's 10. And we haven't increased that since we started giving her an allowance. And we forced her to put, a certain percentage for saving and a certain percentage for giving away
Hmm.
to whatever, cause she wants to, whether that be our church or whether that be, buying toys for kids at Christmas, whatever she
Hmm.
wants. And right now it still feels like it's external motivation for her to do that, but I'm hoping that will become more internal motivation as she gets older. I mean, she just barely turned 10 a few weeks ago, so she's still fairly young, and we haven't been doing an allowance for more than a few years, so this is still fairly new, I guess.
Yeah, you're right in the same age as my oldest. My oldest is also 10. He's 11 this year, and it's so interesting hearing that because my son is very. It just proves what I'm saying. Like every child is different, every family is different. So my son has been getting allowance for around the same amount of time as your daughter. He's been very motivated by giving. Like when
Yeah.
he sees someone in need, like he'll always like see if he has any change or what have you to give something to them. He's done a few different things for charity as well, and he's at times he's very motivated about acquiring things, which is that's one thing, and then at other times he's very motivated by giving. And then there's my daughter who's a couple years younger than him. She's got no interest. Like it's not a thing that she cares about. She's also very motivated by giving, but the idea of acquiring things, she just doesn't care that much. It's not a motivator for her. Which, just again, I only bring that up to highlight that we talked about 3 children in that last 2 minutes, and all 3 of them are very different. So that's why I think it's so important that parents take the lead on teaching financial literacy to children, because in a school setting, you're teaching one to many, right? You can't deal with the nuances of each child and what motivates them and what doesn't. But with a parent, you've got more of a 1-to-1 or a 1-to-2 or what have you. You've got a little bit more understanding of what is it that this child one needs and what is it that what motivates them, and even the conversations that you have. So for, let's say, I'll use my son again as an example. There was a time where he was very into Pokemon, and one of the examples I would use when I was talking about, let's say, supply and demand or inflation or whatever conversations we're having, I would use Pokemon as the example that I would use. Now I wouldn't do that with my daughter because she doesn't care about Pokemon, but again, in a classroom setting, you can't get that type of individual attention and that individual focus. So that's why I think it's so important that parents take the lead on these kind of conversations.
So it sounds like that you have a lot of conversations, as we do, just in daily life. So like, I don't know that we've ever sat down and had a conversation about finances with her in detail, but when things come up in life, we like to highlight it, like, oh, this is math right here, or this is why we're saving. I mean, she's mostly unmotivated by saving because she doesn't have anything to save for, but she is a little confused about her spending versus her saving money. But definitely motivated by giving. So I think their childlike hearts, have a lot to do with that. But um, do you think that we should talk to our kids about our adult finances?
So before I answer that, I want to highlight what you just said, which I think is one of the pieces that I want more parents to focus on. I love
Mhm.
how you said, you haven't sat down and talked about, let's say, money with your child. What you've done is you've taken those, natural moments that come up in your day to highlight a learning, a lesson, a skill, a habit, and that's exactly what I want more parents to do. I don't want you
Okay.
to sit down by the fireplace and say, we're learning personal finance today. Like that's not the thing. It doesn't work. It wouldn't work. But what you've done is you've used those moments that have occurred naturally in your day to day and use it to highlight the things that they need to learn, which is just wonderful. So you've highlighted exactly what I'm trying to do with my book and with what I'm doing. So I'd like to applaud right now, but it'd probably be too loud
Oh,
in the
well,
listeners' ears. But that's wonderful.
well,
Um,
it sounds like, but that's what you have been doing too with your kids. So
exactly. And I think
yeah,
it's, again, you're just taking their natural curiosity and you're just leveraging that to educate them on something that they'll need to know. So I just wanted to highlight that because that's exactly what I want to get across. Now
yeah.
to your question with regards to, do I talk about my personal finances? That's a tricky one. I do. I absolutely do. Just to answer the question, but I want to caveat that with, when we're talking about our own finances, we need to also be very aware and very attuned to the fact that our children are children, right? So we don't want to burden them with stress, anxiety, or any of those things. So if your finances aren't necessarily in a place where you feel comfortable talking about it, and let's say you're working to improve it, parts of those conversations could be very appropriate for your child to say, listen, I've got all this debt. I'm just using making up an example right now, but I've got debt. Debt means that I will be paying more over time for something that I purchased in the past. So one of the things I want to do is reduce this debt and maybe live with less debt. And then these are the steps I'm doing to, pay off my debt and live with less debt. That conversation, I think, is totally appropriate to have with a child. In fact, I would encourage those types of conversations with children. But if the thought and the feelings and the emotions around your debt is, I feel overwhelmed by my debt and I don't know what to do, like that is different, right? Like we don't want to put that on to a child. So while I encourage you to talk openly about your finances, and I think it's important because part of the challenge with personal finance is that much of it really is behind, I don't want to say closed doors, but it's behind, the balance sheet. Like you don't see, I talk about this sometimes when I'm talking to parent groups and workshops and what have you, is wealth is one of those things that you cannot see, right? Like when we're out in the community, we see money that's been spent, but we don't know who has wealth. Wealth is the money that you've saved. That's the money that's in your bank account. So I'll give an example with my family. I remember I was walking down the street with my son and my daughter, and we walked by a car dealership, and I was like, oh, and I, on the dealership, it showed the two people who own the dealership, and the conversation came to one of my children said, well, they must be really rich. And I was like, well, we don't know. Like that, all of what we see here could be built on debt. We don't know if they have anything saved up. It could all be borrowed money. And when you see people with, really nice cars or clothes or a beautiful big house, we don't know how they've acquired that. Again, I mentioned earlier that part of acquiring money is through debt, but it's a lot different than if you have that money in the bank account sitting there waiting for you to retire or invest or what have you. So I think it's important that we do bring our kids into some of these conversations so that they can see what what wealth is, how we save, how we insure our money, and all of these other pieces. So I think to really give a full picture, we do need to let our kids into our personal finances, but we have to do it in a way that also recognizes that there's a child that we're talking to, and our child doesn't need to be burdened with any of the stress or anxiety that we may feel. Now, one of the things I try to do, especially when I talk about money, is to let folks know that there's no need to have anxiety when it comes to money, right? Like if you're in a place that you're not comfortable with, it's a point in time and you could work your way out of it. I know when I was younger, especially when I had a lot of debt, I had a lot of stress, anxiety, and depression. Um, and I speak on this so that I can help folks kind of let that go. But we just need to be very mindful of how we're talking to our kids about our personal finances so that they know that, we are responsible for their well-being and they are taken care of. And that is all set because we don't want them to feel like they are not in a good place, like they're not secured.
No, I think that's a really good point. Let's not take our stress and burdens and put them on our children because they don't need that. They're just
Exactly.
they're children. They've got their
Exactly.
own stress and burdens. They
I
don't
agree
need
with you.
adult they don't need adult stuff. So that's a great point. So I know there's some legality to this next question because there's an age you have to be to get, like a typical credit card. But at what age should we allow our child to have a bank account or a credit card or one of those, little cards they have now that kind of take the place of cash?
Mhm, mhm. Again, I hate to repeat myself, but again, it's personal. It depends on what makes sense for your family. From my standpoint, I like to keep, especially with the younger ones, I like to keep things in cash as long as possible, just because cash is tangible. Once we go to digital, things get a little bit more complicated. It becomes less, I don't want to use the word ethereal, but it's not, seeing numbers and zeros and on a screen is very different than, having cash in hand, or even very different than when you have to like let go of the cash. So, when you're spending money that's in the form of cash and you actually have to hand that over to a cashier, there is a feeling of loss there. Even if you're acquiring something, you still have to give something up. That feeling goes away a little bit when you're dealing with debit and credit cards. So I encourage parents as much as possible to stay with cash as long as possible because that feeling is a necessary feeling to really get a handle on personal finance. You need to know that when you spend money, you are giving something up. That's a critical piece of it. You will be getting something in return, yes, but if that doesn't feel proportional, you might feel like, wait, was that a good trade? Did I give too much money for this thing that I got back? So all of that is very important. So cash as long as possible. I'm not against those debit cards that you can get for children. Again, it depends on the age. I prefer just a bank account. I'm still testing some of these out with my family as well. I've done some of those cards that have an app and all the rest. And
Mhm.
the experience that we had, it was like, I'd rather him just have a bank account that he's experiencing what, just experiencing a bank account. And you're right, there are some legal pieces to that. So it depends on, where you live, like your region and what your banks are willing to do. So some banks will only give debit cards to certain age groups, and then if it's younger than that, there'll probably be some restrictions on the cards. So that it's a very regional uh, determination on how that will work. And I'm not against it, but I like the idea of using a bank account versus those cards. Some of them are really nice though, in that they give you some feedback as to what's happening with your child, and it can help as far as managing the allowances. So there's a lot of conveniences there. So again, if it works for your family, go for it. With regards to the credit card, again, credit cards typically can't be, you can't give a child, a child can't have a credit card on their own. Like it could be a co-card kind of thing where you are co-signing for the card, so you're also responsible for it. Typically, the advantage of that is that you're helping to build your child's credit earlier. So if your child's going to be, I don't know, if you're worried about your child's credit score and building up their credit, the advantage of having that relationship is that your child's credit score and credit report gets built at an earlier age, meaning that they'll have access to more credit, hopefully, assuming you keep your credit score at a high number. They'll get access to credit at an earlier age or have access to it, and potentially more and cheaper. I don't know if there's a huge advantage to that, especially since most credit card companies are usually pretty willing to give young borrowers credit. So I'm not too concerned about that. Maybe there might be a couple percentage point difference if they have an established credit because of this relationship that you established for them. It could work, it could help. I don't see the advantage. I could see a bit of a downside in that now your child also has access to your credit and that could damage your credit scores. So there's probably, in my opinion, of maybe even more risk than benefit there. It again depends on what makes sense for you. So I don't know. I don't know if that if that really answers your questions. It's a lot of depends there, but
Right.
yeah, it would be like there's some advantages to the credit, but and the other piece of it, I think this is probably the bigger piece of it, and it's kind of where I fell into my trap, was that the other rationale for that often is, a credit card is good for an emergency. That's what we often hear. But it isn't necessarily the best solution for an emergency. Yes, it's quick access to money if you have an emergency. So if let's say your child is out and they need, access to money, then here's a credit card to save the day. But I don't think it's a good um, habit to get into to use debt for emergencies. So I encourage, parents, adults to build, an emergency fund, and that's what's used for an emergency. So then to give a child a credit card and say, here, use this form of debt for an emergency, it doesn't jive with the lesson that, you should try to use cash for an emergency. So there's a lot of pieces to that puzzle there, but I don't see a lot of advantages to giving a credit card to a youngster.
Okay. So cash is king in your
Always.
mind.
Yeah, especially
Definitely.
especially for those young ages. Like I think like I don't I'm not 100% cashless. I use debit cards and credit cards myself. But I still every time, when you have that $20 bill in your pocket and you see something for like $2, you're like, do I want to break this 20? And then you're like, if you do, then the $3 that you get back in change is going to fall between the couch cushions. The
Mhm.
$15 that you get back, you're probably going to spend a little easier because it's easier to spend a 5 than it is to spend a 20. And then all of a sudden that $20 is gone. And that
Yeah.
thinking, that thought process, that logic that we just went through is actually a form of saving. It's also a form of, I don't want to spend because, and that again, if you give that to a child, it's powerful. It's like, I don't need this thing. If I really needed it, I wouldn't have had a hesitation because I have to break a 20. That's a ridiculous reason not to buy a $2 item. But if you don't really need the $2 item, then you have that thought. That pause is enough reason for you to say, this really isn't something I need. And if it's not something I need, do I really want to spend my money on it? So yeah, I like cash.
I do too. We thought about getting our daughter one of those little debit cards for her 10th birthday, but then we just, for all the reasons that you've already explained, we just decided to stay with cash.
Yeah,
It feels different, and it's it's emotionally more difficult to spend cash than it
it
is to
is.
just charge card, right?
I agree with you. I agree with you 100%.
So in your book, you say that we shouldn't use the phrase "we can't afford it" when our child asks to buy something. And I love your rationale here. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure, sure. So my thought here is, and again, if it's a personal thing. So if you actually cannot afford something, you can absolutely say it, we can't afford it. But what I found myself doing is using we can't afford it and other phrases like that as an easy out to get out of purchase for a child, for my child. So, you see
Yes.
something and yeah, exactly. You see that thing in the checkout, those impulse buys, and it's like, can I get this gum or whatever? And I'm like, well, we can't afford it. But it's not true. And the problem is, because it's not true and my child can see me going out making other purchases, it throws confusion into what I want to be a very clear process. I want my children to understand what's happening with my finances. I want them to understand what's happening with my purchases. And by using that language, which is what I'm trying to say, is I want you to be very intentional with the words you use, especially when it comes to the money that we're spending, because it could really be confusing for a child to see you spending money on, let's say, yourself. And then as soon as they ask for something, you say you can't afford it. So the messaging there is, I can't afford things for you, but that's not what you're trying to say. What you're really trying to say is, and I joke, like, you don't want to say this at that moment. You really need to have these conversations earlier, but what you're really trying to say is, I've budgeted money for this trip, or we have a set budget for groceries. And that thing that you're asking me for is outside the bounds of the budget. But maybe we can fit it in somewhere else. Maybe that purchase could be in the budget we spend for birthdays or Christmas or whatever. but you want to be more intentional so that your children are actually understanding what's happening, because you don't want them to feel that, they aren't worthy, or they can't, that there's no money in the budget for them, because that could be what they portray and what they feel when you hear something like, I can't afford it. It's an easy out for us, but it's doing a disservice to them. So it's any of those phrases like we can't afford it, or that's not like, I can't think of any answers in the moment, but it's
Like
really
we
about
don't
trying
we
to,
don't have the money.
we don't have the money for that. Like those statements are just like I said, they're easy outs for us, but they just add confusion for our children. So it's about being very intentional. And I don't mean to pass any judgment on anyone who said that and they used it as an out, because I've done it myself. I just want parents to just recognize that we need to be very intentional when we speak to our children, especially about money, because it's already a very confusing subject. Like if you think about how many folks feel uncomfortable managing money, or have that trepidation when talking about money with kids or other adults, like there's already a lot of confusion and involved in money. So it's making sure that we're very clear and intentional when we speak about money with our children.
Yeah, I've absolutely used it as an out. So has my husband. I mean, it's just kind of, I think it was something that we do as parents. It must be in the parenting manual somewhere.
I agree. And like I said, I've used it many times. I don't use it now, or if I do, I will. And this is something else. Like I say all of this and I say it as a parent. So the other day I was talking to my son about doing summer camps, and he wanted to do one summer camp with his one friend, and one summer camp with another friend, and another summer camp and then honestly, we don't have the money for that. But it's one of those things where it's, in the moment, he was badgering me, and I got frustrated and I got flustered, and I was like, and I don't think I said we don't have the money for that. I can't remember specifically what I said, but I was like, no, it's we can't do all of those. And later on, when I was calmer, in a more calm space, I basically explained to him, I was like, here's what we've got money set up for summer camp, and this is what we're going to be spending. So I was much more calm, I was much more clear, I was much more intentional about what we were doing. And that was what I did. So it's about being very intentional, being very clear. So that was why.
Yeah. Right now we're saving for a house, so we've had to have the conversation with our daughter, and we had this conversation. We're saving, all of our extra money, or almost all of our extra money, for a house. That doesn't mean we're not going to go get donuts once in a while. It just means we're not going to go get donuts every Saturday.
Mhm.
And so if we decide we want something, we need to ask ourselves, is this more important, or is getting a house more important? And we've got to make these decisions together.
Mhm.
And she's been really good about understanding that, and compromising, and understanding that she doesn't need all these little things at the checkout line right now, or at all, maybe.
I
So
agree with
that's a plus.
you.
So my child's got some friends who appear to be much more wealthy than we are,
Mhm.
and she frequently asks me, are we poor?
Mm. Mhm. Mhm.
What do we say if our child asks something like that?
So one of the things that are we poor? One of the things I've thought about with regards to are we poor, and what we should say when our child asks, are we poor? It's to give them a moment to think, like, what what do you mean by are you poor? Just kind of get a sense of why they're asking, are they poor? So just give them a moment and say, well, why do you ask? That gives you a little bit of time to figure out, well, why are they asking? Maybe they're asking because they feel poor. Maybe it's because someone asked them, are you poor? So it's giving them just take a moment, just take a pause to get a little bit of context behind the question. Because maybe it's not even a poor thing. Maybe it's just they heard someone use it on the playground, and they just want to understand
Mhm.
what the word means. So it's really just ask them, well, why do you ask, and get a little bit more context, because I know a lot of times you get that question and it could be very jarring, right? And you want to
Mhm.
jump in and be like, no, we're not like, you might want to have like a reflexive answer, but it may not actually answer the child's question, because it's a very personal question, and it could almost feel like you're being attacked in some way. So the first thing I try to encourage parents to do when they hear that kind of a question is just pause and get more context. But the other part of it is, with regards to rich and poor, it's really understanding that no matter where you are financially, there will always be people who have more than you, and there'll be people who have less than you. a lot of books that I read on personal finance. One of my favorites is The Psychology of Money. And one of the concepts that they raise in that book is about understanding what is enough, right? Like we could shoot to have millions or billions or what have you, but again, at some point, there'll still be someone who has more than you, and there'll still be someone who has less than you. And it's really about finding what's enough to make you comfortable and happy and secure and financially well. So talking to your child about being rich and poor, it's explaining to them that no matter where you're coming from with this question, there are always going to be people in the world who have more than you and have less than you, and you have to be comfortable with that. You really have to be comfortable with that. The ideal is that we're helping those who have less than us, because that's, just being a good citizen. And if you feel the need to strive for more, but also understanding that no matter how much you strive for, you have to have at least a point where there's enough, right? Because you can continue to strive for more and more. But again, as I said, there'll always be someone who has more than you. So it's finding that place where you're comfortable. So if you are talking to your child and let's say my child asked me that question, I would say, well, we are relatively wealthy in that we have everything we need. And that's where I think, rich and poor kind of fade away. It's, do you have what you need to survive? Like all your needs are met, and are you happy? Are you comfortable? Are you, are your relationships well, and all these other things? So that's what I talk about when I hear those questions about rich and poor. It's really about, again, recognizing that there's people with more, there's people with less. We should do our best as good citizens to help those with less than us. Understanding that, yes, you can strive for more, but there's still got to be a point where you say, I have enough. And rich and poor don't matter so much as, are your needs met? And if your needs are met, then we're all kind of rich and all wealthy if our needs are all met. So it's such a tricky question. And that's why, I know a lot of parents, when they hear that question, they, like I said, take that moment just to get your breath, because it can be very jarring when you hear it. So take a moment, get your breath, get the context, because the question might not even be like what I answered there might not even be valid for the question that your child's asking you. But just take a moment, get your breath, get your feet under you, and recognize those things. And I think you should be okay.
That's such a good point, such good advice. Well, thank you so much for coming on. Where can we get more information about you, and where can we get your book?
Sure. So you can go to my website. I think most of my information is on there. So it's cliftoncorbin.com. My book is available on Audible, Amazon, Barnes & Noble. You can find it in most places. Again, it's called Your Kids, Their Money. I post quite a bit on LinkedIn. I'm also on Instagram. So on LinkedIn, it's CD Corbin, and on Instagram, my handle is Your Kids, Their Money.
Thank you so much. I'm going to go follow you. Your website is absolutely fantastic. So I encourage everybody to go check it out. There's so much free information. It's incredible.
Thank you. I also have a couple workbooks on there as well. So if you're looking for, fun activities, if your child is, let's say, in grade 3 and down, there's a workbook there that's free to download. I think it's Clifton Corbin /workbook. And then I also have a list of kids books. So my book is written for adults, but I have a list of kids books because I think books and stories are such a great way to teach some of these lessons. So if you go to Clifton Corbin /book list, you could download a list of books that are basically for kids from 0 all the way to teen, that are just phenomenal books that will help your kids internalize some of these lessons.
Yeah, definitely everybody go do that. It's great information. And make sure to subscribe to this podcast so you don't miss any health, parenting, or life advice. For my freebie, 30 Ways to Relieve Pain Without Taking a Pill, go to ithurtstomom.com/tips or @ithurtstomom on Instagram. If you have any comments, suggestions, or want to be on this podcast, please email me at ithurtstomom@gmail.com. I wish everybody a blessed and pain-free day.